Good evening. Can you hear me? Well, okay. Good evening to all of you. Uh, Before I start anything, I would like to say that those are my parents in the cover of the book, and they would be extremely pleased to see an audience of so many youngsters here. So thank you for having me here and for being here. And with this, I'll start. Good evening to everyone. My name is Jeannette Grunhaus de Gelman, as Marty said, and I am extremely honored to be here with you. I thank the Akron Summit Council on Holocaust and Genocide Education and its board members for this invitation. The title of this year's summit, Lessons of the Holocaust, How Hatred Turns to Violence, immediately caught my attention because this subject is very close to me and to my family's history, because I am the daughter of Polish survivors from Rodawa, a small town in eastern Poland. And my parents, Hill Grunhaus and Alexandra Lederman, were the only survivors in their immediate family of 25. Examining their journey, you will hear how hatred quickly degenerated into violence and took its toll not only on their family, my family, but on all of the 6 million Jews that were murdered in the Holocaust. Since my early childhood, I felt strongly the loneliness that other friends did not have. It came from not having cousins, not having aunts and uncles, and especially not having grandparents. Until I understood why all my family had been killed in the Holocaust. So it is evident that these feelings about the Holocaust were a part of me since I was a little girl. But it was only very late in my life that I came to writing my parents' story. And there were some circumstances that delayed and triggered this decision. In the year 2000, my mother expressed her wish to go to Poland in a trip organized by survivors from her town. My brother, my sister, and I decided to go with her. My sister and I arrived in Warsaw before the group. That night in Poland, we walked around Warsaw, and to our astonishment, there were almost no signs that would remind the visitor of the 3,300,000 Jews that existed in Poland in 1939 when the war broke out. It was as if they had been completely erased from Polish history. It was then that I decided that that could not be. My ancestors could not have been erased from Polish history. And I decided that I had to research my family's history and I had to write my parents' story so our children and our grandchildren could know where they came from and honor forever their memory. So in 2018 came out the Spanish version of my book with the title, En los días claros cantábamos. Spanish is my native language. And then in 2022 came the translation that you see there, On Sunny Days We Sang, a Holocaust story of survival and resilience. My family came, as I said, from Rodawa, a small town with a population of 9,500 inhabitants, 60% of which were Jewish, that is 5,600. Of those 5,600, only 50 survive, and among them, my parents. My father, Hill, and I want to tell you a little bit about my parents and their story. My father, Hill, was born in 1904 to a well-off Orthodox family of 6. My grandfather, Jacob, had been his ancestors in the lumber business. So my father first worked with his father, and then he went independent in 1928 and moved to northern Poland to Danzig. He was in Danzig when the war broke out. My mother, Hannah Schendel, later known as Alexandra, which was a false name she adopted in 1942, but she decided to keep for the rest of her life, was born in 1924 to a family of 7 siblings. Her father owned a store in the center of town, selling all sorts of goods, but his life and that of his family, because they were Hasidic, evolved around religion. My parents were second cousins, but they didn't relate because they were from different generations. 20 years difference. So at the beginning of the war, each one of them went their own path until in the middle of 1943, when their destinies came together. The war broke out September 1st, 1939, with the invasion of Poland. The Germans arrived in Vlodava on September 16th, and for the Jews of Vlodava, the war turned upside down. As in all the territories under German control, restrictions and laws were quickly established after they were occupied. Violence and terror ruled everyday life. The objective was to limit for the Jews all their civil and economic rights, lead them to sickness and poverty, and eventually eliminate them all. The Germans had planned with detail every step of the process. Vlodava was a town that was on the border on a river, the River Bug, and on the border with the Soviet Union. But it was a town that had a very swampy area. So when the war started, the Germans brought in a company called Rode that came to dry up the waters and prepare the land for planting. So another company came for planting, and another third company came in. Why am I talking about this? This meant that these three companies gave work to 2,000 Jews, more or less. And why was this important? This was important because if you were a Jew during the war in a small town in Poland, and you had a work permit, which is what these companies gave, for a little while, you felt safe and you were not detained and killed in the middle of the street. So Vlodava had these three companies, and they were important for my parents. One of them, the manager, was called Bernard Falkenberg, who was a German, but who, since he arrived in Vlodava, he understood what the other Germans were doing. He came from a communist background. He was not a Nazi. And he helped my father and many Jews to safety. So he's a very important man. He was later on named Righteous Among the Nations by Yad Vashem, the Israeli institution. So the first years of the war, my mother, who was 15 when the war broke out, was under the guidance of her father and her oldest sister, Esther. And she taught, for 2 years, she taught little children to read and write. But soon she understood the importance of having a work permit. So she was hired by one of these companies, and she got her work permit and worked with that. My father was, the first 2 years of the war, he was not in Vlodava. He was in Warsaw. But in 1942, he came back to Vlodava, and he became friendly with Falkenberg right away. And Falkenberg gave him two important things. First, a false work permit called Kennenkarte, and then an ID under the name of Henry Gaida, which would be very useful for my father. So 1942 begins, and very important events start coming. In 1942, in May, one of the 6 extermination camps that the Nazis built to kill all the Jews was opened in our town, 7 miles away from Vlodava. Why was it so important? Well, first of all, because the Nazis were implementing their systematic killing of the Jews. But for Vlodava, it was even more so important because now everybody was in danger. So the Nazis collected all the Jews through roundups. And in Vlodava, there were 5 roundups that began May 24th, 1942 to May 1st, 1943. By the end, in 1943, all the Jews of Vlodava, except those, like my parents, that had escaped, had been killed. What happened with their families? My mother's family was okay working until 1942. And then the roundup started. In the second roundup, one of her sisters and her husband and the kids were caught and killed. The rest lived until the last roundup. My father's family was divided. Part of it was in Volodava, part in another town called Kovel. His mother was taken in the third roundup. But then the last roundup arrives, and everybody's going to be caught. So everybody had to hide. My father hid with his brother and his brother's family, but one of the little boys coughed, and the Germans found him. But my father managed to escape. He hid in Falkenberg's house. Remember that I told him he would be important for him? He hid in Falkenberg's house until the partisans arrived, and then he escaped from Vlodava with the partisans. But my father was 39 in 1942, 43. Sorry, in 43. So he could not keep up pace with the partisans. So he said to the partisans, I have gold coins. I'll give you coins. I'll give you money so you can buy arms, but find me a hiding place, which they did. They found him a hiding place in a farmer's house about 15 miles from Vlodava. And so he was the only, by that time, my father was the only one left that he knew, because once the Nazis caught somebody, you didn't know if they were shot instantly or they were taken to Sobibor. There are no records of the people from Vlodava going to Sobibor, so we couldn't check any of that. My mother, on the other hand, stayed with her sister Esther, and they hid for 3 days in the cellar during the last roundup in May 1st, 1943. And after that, they ran into the forest to a little place called Adampol, where they were staying. What happened then, my mother and Esther remained in the forest in Adampol until they met the partisans from Vlodava that knew them well. And the partisans told them, you are cousins of Gil. He's hiding. Why don't you go and hide with him? Messages started coming and going, and the result was that the farmer said, no, I cannot hide more than one person. So my father said to Esther and my mother, I'm leaving, I'm giving you the place, I'm going to Warsaw. One of you come and stay here. Esther, who was older than my mother and who always took care of her, told her, you go, I'll take care. So my mother went off to the farmer's house, and Esther stayed in Adampol. She did not take care of herself. She was killed 2 months later in the last roundup that the Germans did in Adampol. So it was here in July 1943 that my father Gil and my mother Alexandra's life together began. My father, who was cosmopolitan and smart, took over making all the decisions and leading the way with determination. My mother followed. My father was in Warsaw, and my mother stayed in Vlodava, hiding in the farmer's house. But in November, he sent for her, and he placed her in the house of a lady that didn't have any family in Warsaw, and they stayed in Warsaw until October 1944, when there was a Polish uprising, and as a consequence of the uprising, the Germans killed 200,000 Poles and evacuated the city. So everybody went out, and some of the people were given the chance to go to Germany and work. And my father, who was very smart, said to my mother, if we stay in Poland, Poles recognize Jews. They're going to catch us. Let's go to Germany. They won't recognize us there. And they did. They went to work to Upper Silesia, and in fact, it was lucky. It was called slave labor, but for them it was not very slave-like, because my father was working in a textile company and my mother was working in a farm. And they were free to stay in the same town, but in the town they could go anywhere. My mother, who was passing as a Pole, learned to pray. She went with the other Poles, she went to the church, and she watched what others did, and she passed as a Pole without any problem. And this continued until liberation, which was in March 31st, 1945, when the Russians came and liberated them. Then they decided to go back to Poland and to Vlodava to see if anybody had survived. On the way in Lodz, they got married. March 31st, 1945, and they initiated a new life together. The return to Vlodava and the realization that no one from either family had survived was a very difficult moment in their lives, you can imagine. But my father decided we have to leave Poland, and a friend offered them visas to an unknown place to them, Venezuela. They accepted and began preparations to leave. I was born in January in Poland. We crossed over to Germany, then to France, Paris, and by November, we were in Venezuela. My father was offered a job as a manager of a sawmill in Maracaibo, the second city in Venezuela. So we moved there in March of 1947, and that's where we lived for many, many years. Maracaibo was then a small city of 200 inhabitants. The first few years in Venezuela were, I'm sure, challenging, even though my parents did not mention it. A new language, Spanish, a new culture, a whole new reality, and the climate. Maracaibo had an average climate of 85, 90 degrees all year round, and my parents came from Poland, so you can imagine. Unfortunately, in the 50s, air condition came, and that saved the tragedy my mother was passing with this heat. Since their arrival in Venezuela, my parents had mainly interacted with Jews. And once in Maracaibo, the small Jewish community that was already established there helped them adapt rather well to their new life. Soon they found themselves participating in all the activities and made a group of friends that they kept for all their life. Education was an essential value in our household, something our parents were not able to have and wanted us to have. Honesty and generosity were also a part of our rearing, but they had not forgotten their strong upbringing in Judaism, and they wanted the same for us. They taught us to be proud of being Jewish, to lead our lives according to the Jewish values and traditions, but at the same time, accepting others that had other beliefs. There was no room for hate, no room for violence. They had experienced in their own flesh the result of hatred, and they did not want us to be victims like they had been, nor make others victims either. My parents' story illustrates the consequences of the actions that result from the hate of others, different others, and the extreme forms of intolerance that man can attain. This seems to have happened a long time ago, and yet today that we're celebrating Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day, hatred and violence have reappeared stronger than ever, as all the people that preceded me have discussed. A worldwide rise in anti-Semitism acts and statements has been reported. You all must have witnessed them over the media. We hear and we see hate of all kinds at extreme levels, even here, for me, even surprisingly, even here in the United States, and it's very scary. The Anti-Defamation League reports over 400% increase in anti-Semitism just in the last few months. And these are not the latest numbers. So we ask ourselves, what can be done? An extremely difficult question for all of us, because we all have to do it. But we have to hope that there can be an answer. With so many young people in the auditorium, there's something that can be done to revert this tendency. We have to be more vigilant and hope, really hope, that one of the answers lies in education. The only way to stop this horrific wave of anti-Semitism is, I believe, partially through education, especially education of the youngsters. If we manage to make them understand this basic principle, maybe we will have won the beginning of the battle, just the beginning. But now I would like to end looking back to my parents' story, honoring their courage, admiring the resilience that was required of them to be able to live day after day, losing a family member after another, a friend after another, and try to stay alive. Thank you for sharing with me my parents' journey, and good night.
Well done. Well done. Well done. I'd like to ask Rini and Esther and Ethan